Well, good evening, everybody. Can I start by acknowledging and paying my respect to the traditional custodians of the land upon which we're all meeting this evening, the Gadigal people, and to extend those respects to their elders past and present, and to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are here with us this evening. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. By acknowledging country in Parliament, we aim to continue breaking down barriers and building trust across communities around the state. The Parliament of New South Wales strives to work alongside Aboriginal communities to listen to their voices and to build a better future for New South Wales. For those who haven't met me, my name is Ben Franklin. I am the President of the Legislative Council and one of the two presiding officers here at the New South Wales Parliament, alongside my good friend, the Speaker of the Legislative Assembly, the Honourable Greg Piper. This evening I'm actually wearing two hats, one as the President of the Legislative Council in its bicentenary year, but the other as one of the 5 co-chairs of the Parliamentary Friends Group for LGBTQIA+, who is co-hosting this event tonight as part of the bicentenary of the Legislative Council series. The 25th of August this year will be exactly 200 years since the first sitting of the Legislative Council. And the building that you entered through tonight is the oldest continuously operating public building in the country. During our bicentenary year, we're acknowledging this significant milestone and our collective history by reflecting on our past, celebrating our present, and importantly, imagining the future of democracy in this state, a future that you are all part of. Throughout this year, we're hosting a range of events, including an open day, concerts, conferences, and regional roadshows across the state. And tonight is another important element of that program. The Bicentenary Seminar Series aims to foster conversations about the valuable contribution diverse communities and diverse representation has made to democracy in this state, while providing an opportunity to reflect on how we can continue to engage and support diverse voices into the future. This evening, we're focusing on the LGBTQIA+ community. The experience of our community in New South Wales has transformed profoundly, evolving across over 40 years of momentous change from a position of marginalisation and discrimination to bipartisan support and landmark law reform. This seminar explores how the journey unfolded in New South Wales, told through powerful stories and personal insights from some of those who lived through the experience. Tonight is also an acknowledgement and a celebration of the bicentenary of not just the Legislative Council, but also of the Supreme Court of New South Wales. And I'm particularly delighted to acknowledge and to welcome the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court here tonight, the Honourable Andrew Bell, and also Justice Peden from the Supreme Court, who happens to be the great-granddaughter of a former President of the Legislative Council. Thank you both for being here. Can I also thank our esteemed panellists this evening? To my right, the Honourable Justice Richard Weinstein SC, a current Justice of the Supreme Court. To his right, the Hon Penny Sharpe, not only the Leader of the Government in the Upper House in New South Wales, but also the Minister for Energy, Climate Change, the Environment and Heritage. And Trevor Khan, a current local court magistrate and a former Deputy President of the Legislative Council of New South Wales. Unfortunately, you will notice that there is not a fourth chair tonight. And I regret to inform you that unfortunately Virginia Bell is unwell and unable to join us. She was particularly excited to do this panel. We had a little meeting about it only a few days ago, and she is very sorry that she can't be here, and I know that we wish her a very speedy recovery. Before I begin, can I also acknowledge all of my parliamentary colleagues who are here tonight, and particularly my fellow co-chairs of the Parliamentary Friendship Group of the LGBTQIA+ community. Alex Greenwich, someone who has been obviously a passionate supporter and friend to us all for many, many years. The Honourable Chris Rath, who is seriously making his mark in this place. Dr. Amanda Conn, a wonderful new addition to the Upper House, and of course, Minister Sharpe. We have 5 co-chairs of the Parliamentary Friendship Group from across the political spectrum, all united in our commitment to you, our LGBTQIA+ community, as well as the many active allies here with us today. So thank you all for being here, and let's get started. This evening we will focus on 4 specific areas before we get to the end where you'll get your turn. There will be a Q&A session at the end, so feel free to think about what you'd like to ask as we move through. But let's start where we need to start, at 1978. In June 1978, people took to Sydney's streets in what was an event for the generations, Sydney's first Mardi Gras March. Their banners and placards, colourful and potent, called for change for the LGBTQIA+ community, an end to criminalisation and discrimination, and an equal future. The 1978 march remains a watershed moment in civil and political rights in New South Wales that we continue to celebrate today. And just a few years later, an emerging health crisis, the HIV/AIDS pandemic, would add even greater urgency to reform for our LGBTQIA+ community. Now, reform was not just about rights, it was about lives. It's a powerful place to start a compelling story of 4 decades of incredible reform. If Virginia was with us this evening, she would talk about her time as a community lawyer, working at the Redfern Legal Centre to do legal advocacy for those first Mardi Gras protesters who were arrested, as well as other legal issues affecting the broader gay community. But Trevor, you played a key role as the upper house sponsor of the landmark 2014 laws that removed historical convictions for gay men arrested under laws before homosexuality was decriminalised. You met with those who had been convicted. Can you tell us about how they spoke of their experience during this early period?
Well, I think in terms of those who are impacted by the actions of the community and the police, I think there was just a profound feeling of injustice. And I think we saw that in terms of drawing the bill, that what we saw was that the police used an extraordinary range of acts that were never designed to charge people, men, with a variety of acts. I know, for instance, Peter Bonsall-Boone was charged, I think it was under the Vagrants Act. And one of the difficulties I can say in drawing the bill was when there was an attempt to examine those who are impacted by decades of being hounded, you just couldn't really draw a bill that adequately encompassed that level of hounding and injustice that they went through. And I think for people like Bon, at the end of the day, what he wanted was a recognition of that injustice that he had suffered, and hopefully to an extent, in Bon's case, very close to the end of his life, but hopefully to an extent, the Parliament finally righted an extraordinary wrong done to so many people.
Penny, have you got experience about how the people of that time spoke about what they had to endure?
Well, I feel a bit nervous about talking about this. There are quite a lot of 78ers here tonight. I want to welcome them to this event and to thank you for that work. Couple of things that I would say. One is that there was a lot leading up to 1978. There was a lot of organising, there was a lot of discussions, there was probably interminable collective meetings in some cases, fights, walkouts. Robin's nodding. It's good to see you, Robin. I think that was part of it. But, like all movements of the time, it's about fighting injustice and about being treated fairly before the law where laws do not support you. And, 1978, we talk about it being a march. It wasn't really a march. It ended up being a riot. And people were bashed and there was extreme violence. There was also, an incredible pushback from that. And I think, as I sit here as the leader of the government, and I've said this many times, people like me stand on the shoulders of those that were prepared to not take no for an answer and were prepared to push through and make governments do things. Because while I'm at the pointy end of reform and I've been really privileged to be part of changing the laws, that hasn't happened because governments have decided that it's a good idea. It's happened because of community action and community involvement. And as I said, that thing that I love particularly, that tenacity that says we're not taking no for an answer, we're not going away. You know, in the lead up to 78 and to do decriminalisation, you know, shout out to the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence who had a caravan out the front of Premier Rand's house for quite a long time. You know, considered shocking at the time, but just brilliant, funny, irreverent, but at its core about change. And I think, you know, 78, and I'm really sad that Virginia wasn't here because she could actually speak to it from someone who was there. And I wouldn't pretend to do that except to be profoundly grateful, but just to recognise that these things don't happen overnight and they don't happen just because someone in Parliament decides it's a good idea.
I think as part of the community, I think the 78ers are almost revered, as they should be. And it is wonderful that we now have the physical embodiment of a museum in Utopia at that place, which was so horrific for so many homosexual men and women. Richard, having something that was formerly the embodiment of what was the law at the time, but obviously misused, now as a museum to celebrate our history, it's pretty significant.
Well, look, I have to say, I only came to Australia in 1981. And will say this, a little off point, I apologise, but when I came to Australia in 1981, it never occurred to me that homosexuality was illegal coming from Canada. Having had leadership in the federal government in Canada when I was a boy, Pierre Trudeau decriminalised homosexuality, crime being a federal matter in Canada, and he famously saying that the government had no business in the bedrooms of the nation. Well, I grew up like that, and so it really was a very big surprise to me arriving here. It probably took me many, many months to realize that I was engaging in illegal activity. Look, I'm a justice of the Supreme Court now. I confess. It didn't stop me. It's good being 22. But can I say that even then, when I arrived, I knew about the 78ers because I knew people who were 78ers. And I didn't like to go near that place across the street from where I now occasionally run criminal trials, which was the police station in Darlinghurst. And in fact, in those years, I wore a whistle around my neck. And it wasn't really the general public I was afraid of. It was the police that I was afraid of. And I was going to blow that whistle so that hopefully people would come to my aid. How wonderful it is and ironic that that spot now is a museum to our history.
Absolutely. And also how wonderful, I think, in showing how far we've come, that was supported vociferously by both sides of Parliament, that we've now got to a point where these things are almost bipartisan.
Can I say one more thing? You said I could interrupt,
Please,
right?
you must.
So Virginia Bell was supposed to be here tonight, and she famously acted at Redford Legal Centre in 1978 on behalf of many of the people who were bailed or were going to be bailed as a result of this riot. But she said at our recent meeting that really most of the credit should go to Justice Carolyn Simpson, who has recently retired from our court, who acted as a barrister, Virginia being a solicitor at that time, who acted pro bono for those persons. So we really should give a shout out to Carolyn Simpson.
Penny, in preparing for tonight, I was reading back issues of Hansard, because I'm a dork.
It's always
And-
down.
In Hansard, you said that you went to your very first Mardi Gras in 1992. So that means you're part of a different generation to the 78ers. I guess, can you give us some understanding of what's changed for LGBTQIA plus women in your generation 92 from those who first marched in 78?
Well, I think it's important to understand the context of 1992. So I grew up in Canberra and I just moved up to Sydney to study, and I was involved in the student union at the University of New South Wales. And there was a few things going on at that time. We were right in the middle of the HIV crisis, and what I remember as a young woman living in Sydney, just kind of working out what was going on with my life, was the many notices in the Sydney Star Observer as people were dying, the violence on the streets. Richard, you might have been wearing whistles at the time. I remember Penny Gulliver running self-defence classes. Hey, Jenny, you remember all this too. Jenny was one of the first lesbian officers at the University of New South Wales, and we were there together. Yeah, give her a clap. And we were doing that sort of thing, and we were wearing whistles as well, because the violence was pretty, you sort of forget actually, and then you start for these events and you prepare this and you go, no, I remember what this was like, and for those who experienced it, obviously they don't. The other thing that I think that was different is we had one gay member of parliament, and I know we're going to talk about Paul O'Grady in a little while, but it was sort of a strange place. I think for women, violence was something that was a really big deal. I think for many lesbians in particular, we were at the front of the caring part of the HIV epidemic. Many were looking after friends and family and volunteering and doing that work. But I think the other thing for women as well is that the sort of intersection with feminism was always something that's been important to us. So whether it was reproductive rights, which is something that I've been very attached to and involved in over many years, reproductive rights and things like reviewing family law, because of course there were many women whose ex-partners were trying to take their children because they were lesbians. So I think the experience is sort of an intersectional one, where you can't, I think, remove sexism and misogyny from the experience of lesbians, which is slightly different to that of gay men. But in 1992, that for me, at the first Mardi Gras, I was a volunteer for Mardi Gras. We were out the front near the Flinders. We were just, helping move the barricades around. But we were with the Australian deaf community who really embraced us on that night. I think it was profoundly, for me, a real change from my now partner, who we've been together for over 30 years. We were just like pretending that we weren't lesbians at that time. We were just hanging out. But anyway, Mardi Gras was, let's just say, was an important event in that development as well.
You also mentioned another incredibly important event, which is the pandemic, the HIV/AIDS pandemic, and something that broke into national consciousness through a range of ways, but one of the most obvious for those old enough to remember was, of course, the Grim Reaper campaign. Trevor, I wonder what your reflections are about the importance of the HIV/AIDS pandemic and how it defined and set perceptions about the community at that time.
Well, I think one of the difficulties is it's looked at in different parts of the Australian community in different ways. Clearly, the governments of all persuasions went into campaigns such as the Grim Reaper campaign with good intent. It clearly there was a desire, as I think most governments in the end did, to support the gay community. But the campaign terrified the larger Australian community. Within the LGBTI community, of course, the terror, I think, was different. For those of us who lost people that we knew, I lost at least 2 school friends and a friend from university. It was the tragedy that impacted so many. There was I think for so many, there was a psychological weight that was imposed that hung over at least parts of the community for well over a decade. I can remember once I'd entered Parliament, I went out, I can't remember the name of that building that we had the terrible fight up the Parramatta River over, that Luke Foley made an absolute meal of, but he did it very well. But we went to this institution that had been used, and in fact still was being used as a dementia clinic, and it was a dementia clinic at least to a significant extent with those who were suffering from AIDS. And the feeling of walking through the grounds there was just terribly oppressive, terribly oppressive. So I think to an extent, for the wider community, once I'll withdraw that. It remains a scar on so many, particularly older members of the community, that I think will live with those people for the rest of their life. But I think the one positive is it was one of the factors that led to the breakdown of the hard political rules between left and right. It became a humanitarian issue and allowed a lot of the work that followed to flow through in the Parliament. That's the only good thing you can say in terms of what occurred.
I think, Richard, as well, the impact of HIV/AIDS created some extraordinary practical legal issues for members of the community as well. So I think if you'd like to comment on the impact of those at the time.
No, I don't. But I do. Well, I have a lot to say though. Maybe it'll work its way in. But just to Trevor's point, the years, I think 1983 to 1996 is how I look at those terrible years, which were like living through a war. That's how I look at it. It's sort of like the World War I extended for my generation of gay men. And 1996 was the advent of combination therapies, and that changed the landscape considerably. But those 13 years, I was a very young man. It felt as if the world was falling apart, and that all the gains that we had made in the 1970s, I mean, the young people laugh to hear the words gay lib. But it was a thing in the 70s when I was a very young boy, and that I was looking forward to. But it sort of stopped all of that. And I thought, really, as a 23-year-old or whatever, I thought that was the end, and we were going to be terribly marginalized forever. But in fact, as a half-glass full guy that I am, in fact, looking back, it created opportunities for coalitions between mostly marginalized communities, gay men and lesbians, gay men, lesbians, and transgender people, sex workers, IV drug users. I mean, all of a sudden there are a lot of people. And all of these people, along with, it's important to say, our incredibly kind, straight allies, made a difference. And it is all of us, all of those people, that actually made incredible strides. I mean, if you saw that video, look what happened in those years. Years when there were no combination therapies, when people were dying. I just want to say one more thing, and that's this. My partner, husband of 30 years, is here today, just over there. Also named Richard. And I've said to him recently that it's only recently that I've been able to look back at that time. So traumatic was it for me as a young person growing up. Losing so many friends and lovers that I blocked it out. And it really is only in the past couple of years that I've been able to revisit it as an older person and start being able to come to terms with happened then. So traumatic was it. But it really, the good news is that it really did create this groundswell of goodwill, I think, in the community generally, not everyone, but in the community generally. And I think that those coalitions that we forged endure, in fact, and have taken us to other places. I mean, that's how I think we got to marriage equality, in fact, by exploiting those coalitions. I've said too much. I'm not sure I answered your question, but anyway, there you go.
I'm glad you didn't, frankly. But that was a perfect segue to our second topic, which is, of course, because of that time, the first foundations for change were laid. It wasn't long before the calls for reform on Sydney's streets reverberated into the two Houses of Parliament right here in Macquarie Street. The first change came in 1982 with laws passed making discrimination on the grounds of homosexuality unlawful, followed 2 years later by decriminalisation.
Okay, I have to stop you there. So how does 82 precede 84? Can you just explain that to me? It doesn't make sense, does it?
I can explain
Yeah,
it.
can you explain it? Like,
Politics.
84 should have come before 82, right?
Of course. Politics being the art of the possible. There's a raging campaign in the community from CAMP and others post-78 with the 78ers on the streets every day, demanding change. We've got people getting sick. We've got a whole lot of things going on. The Rand government at the time didn't have the numbers in the Parliament to actually decriminalise. There was 4 attempts at decriminalisation before we actually got there, but did manage to get the discrimination part in because they could get in that because, you know, actually actively saying we want to discriminate against people is actually a pretty hard political thing for everyone to make. Still was controversial at the time, but it really, I mean, I don't know whether Trevor's got a view about this, but I mean, I really think that it was that classic politics is the art of the possible. That was what could be achieved at that point to at least provide some protection for people not being thrown out of their houses, being able to go to work, you know, those kind of things. Still with a bunch of exemptions though, by the way. And then it was the push around decrim, which took four goes before it could be done. Again, highly controversial, conscience votes. So this, again, it wasn't something that Parliament decided to do because it was great. Essentially, Neville Wran had to hook up a bit of a deal where he kind of wound it. Sounds familiar? Had to wind it through the Parliament with, you know, a few votes here and a few votes there and a few people not turning up for the vote and it being really close and it being like it was, you know, the other end of it as political professionals, you know, admire the strategy and tactics to get there, but that's why it didn't happen that way, just because there weren't the numbers. There was a huge backlash. In my party, the Labor Party at the time, very different party than it was, you know, that it is now to what it was then. Just literally you had members of the party defying decisions, working, you know, as those who were working so hard to get it done, those that were trying to stop it were working just as hard behind the scenes.
I mean, that's, as I understand it, from recollection, that was a lot of that work was Polanda. Is that right?
Oh, look, yeah, huge amount, yeah. Huge amount of people involved in it. I don't know whether Robert and, you know, again, I've met with Ken, all of those people who, again, were working really hard behind the scenes, forming those coalitions. there's a lot of, no one likes to see how the sausages are made, but can I just say that was the challenging to get that piece up, as I understand it.
Well, there are a lot of sausages made in the 80s and 90s. And that was the start, right? And then protections against discrimination and vilification were extended to those living with HIV/AIDS in 94. And the transgender community in 1996, we were the first Australian jurisdiction to do that. The same 96 laws provided legal recognition of post-operative transgender persons. I mean, that's almost 30 years ago. That's a wonderful thing to be proud of. They really were, the 80s and 90s, an important foundation in protecting the rights of our community and making inroads towards equality. But Penny, in 2014 and more recently this year, you referred to the decriminalisation of homosexuality as monumental law reform that paved the way for decades of change. So I'd love the three of you to reflect on just how significant that decriminalisation was.
I'll go first. I'll let these other two speak. Look, I think again, you need to understand the context. This was in the time of the HIV crisis. People were dying. People, they weren't allowed to visit their partners in hospital. They were losing their homes when one of them died, and the parents would come and chuck them out, and they had no recognition in the law for the fact that this had been a house that they'd shared together with their partner, and that they, treated like de factos. I mean, I think I always reflect on the marriage equality stuff, and I sometimes bore our young people with this by saying, look, marriage equality wasn't a thing back then. We were just desperate to make sure that people were treated fairly in the practical ways that they could do that, and that was about visiting your partner in hospital, making sure you had wills and probate, dealing with, equality of, what happened to your superannuation and all of those kind of things. I think that was the important part. But at the same time, you couldn't have done any of that, and you couldn't have done the peer work to actually save the tens of thousands of lives we did as a result of our HIV response if homosexuality was still illegal. How are you supposed to do the work, do the campaigns, give the information? The work that sex workers did, going into the brothels around town, injecting drug users did all of that work. You need to have a legal system that actually allows that to occur. And there's still some problems with that, by the way. Yeah. But I think that decriminalisation was important because it opened it up to say it was symbolically it meant there's nothing wrong with anyone. Having sex, two men or two women, it's totally fine. All of those things. But
you were always okay, though.
Well, we were sort of okay.
You were never illegal.
We were sort of okay.
Lesbianism was not against the law.
It wasn't
And
against
away
the
we
law.
go, ladies and gentlemen.
It wasn't against the law, but
I
the
refer you
oppression
to the
flowed
recent
through
case of
from that.
Lamb.
Indeed. But what it opened up was the ability to actually do all of that work, and without it, everything would have been so much harder. And frankly, more people would have lost their lives.
Yeah.
Trevor?
No, what pennies? don't need to comment. No. All good.
We can argue about lesbians if you like.
Yeah. No.
Look, I don't think I have anything to add either. Except to say that, as I said, arriving here in 1981, it never occurred to me that what I was doing was against the law. And it never bothered me. I didn't care that it was, but it was so important, really. So many years after, Lord Devlin said in the UK that, it should be decriminalised. It was very long after the fact. I really thought that, honestly, I thought that Australia was rather behind the times.
It was.
It was rather, I'm just trying to be nice. And in fact, at the same time, having such a vibrant gay and lesbian community. In 1984, I'm clearly quite a bit older than you. By 1984, I had been to a couple of Mardi Gras at the Paddington Town Hall that, were celebrations of gay and lesbian lifestyles. I think it was the Gay Mardi Gras then, before it became the Gay and Lesbian Mardi Gras, and then changed its name several times. But, it was a fact on the ground that no one could deny, and yet it was illegal. Anyway, that's all.
The first Mardi Gras in '78 actually also saw another reform happen, which was in the Legislative Council, where there was a referendum to have the first directly elected Legislative Council in New South Wales. Before that time, at least some of the members were appointed. And with that, of course, came the rise of the crossbench. So the first crossbencher, I think, was elected in 1981. And then from 1988, no government has had a majority in the upper house. So for any government to pass any legislation, they have to get crossbench support. And I guess I'm interested in how the crossbench played the role in terms of reforming and debating these issues. And if, starting perhaps with Trev, if you have any views about that through what you know historically and your personal experience with seeing some of these pieces of legislation debated and ultimately passed.
Well, I've got to say, the crossbench is self-evidently not a uniform group of people. They cover all extremes of politics, and from my personal view, often quite opportunist in their approach. They will pick a particular issue and flog it to death, being quite intemperate a lot of the time. And I know I was going to say it. You've got Fred Nile standing out in the rain praying for more and all that he wants. You've got the other extreme trying or demanding something that is just fundamentally impossible, and every permutation in between. So I don't always know if they play an entirely constructive role. But the one thing you can say, and I'll come back to Fred in a sec, the one thing you can say is that what they do is they highlight particular issues, and they repeatedly highlight those issues, and they eventually force the major parties to address those issues. So it's not actually that they, a lot of the time, achieve much by legislation. It's the force of their nature, their character, that either by their extreme opposition to something forces people into the light to say, look, this is just ridiculous, we can't keep doing this. Or alternatively, say on the left, putting up positions which you know are not achievable, but you know something's achievable, and therefore you can take the essential core of that idea and turn it into a workable piece of legislation. So there's a profoundly important role that the crossbenchers played in all the time that I was there. But the one thing I will also say, and it might be the wrong time, but I'll say it, you can't take a person who's in the crossbench and say, that person, I don't think I ever said I hate a person in politics, because that's investing emotional capital that really is not useful. But what you can say is, if you said there is nothing about that person that I agree with, almost always you're wrong. There's something in everyone where there are profound areas of agreement. Fred Nile, you won't agree with a lot of what he says, but on First Nations people, profoundly consistent over, I think, all the time he was in politics, that governments were inadequate in their response to disadvantage. Domestic violence, Fred was strong and always strong, and that strength that Fred had on domestic violence eventually played out as one of the reasons why he actually supported the abolition of the homosexual advance defence. Like, who would have thought that you'd get Fred over the line on that? At the same time, he was standing out in the rain hoping to knock over Mardi Gras. But he was still prepared to support the abolition of that partial defence. So what it really is important for politicians as well as members of the public is never give up on anyone who's there. They've all got something within their character that you may be able to use. A lot of the time you don't find it, but it's there somewhere.
Penny, as the leader of the government, you have to deal with the current crossbench, who consists of the Greens, the Legalised Cannabis Party, the Animal Justice Party, the Libertarian Party, One Nation, and 3 independents.
Shooters, Fishers and
Oh,
Farmers.
my apologies, the Shooters, Fishers and Farmers, how could we forget? As the current leader of the government, would you like to make any comments about the crossbench?
You know, democracy is what it is, and everyone has their form of it. I mean, for people who are in the audience and probably, you know, don't know the ins and outs of it, the way that the upper house in New South Wales is elected, you really only need around sort of 4% of the vote to get yourself elected, which is why we have such a range. When we've had, you know, better future for our children, we used to have the Democrats, just in the time that I've been there, Outdoor Recreation Party, we've had a range. But I'd probably really just go back to Trevor's point, which is that when governments don't have the numbers, it means we're actually forced to work harder to build consensus. And look, you know, my life would be much easier if the government had a majority. I would really like that. Not happening anytime soon. But also, do I really think that democracy is better as a result of the crossbench? Actually, I think I do. And I think holding executive government to account, which is the role of the Legislative Council, which our lower house colleagues really hate, but also building consensus for long-term change, I think is a very important thing that we can do and that communities can do. I think the profound change we've seen in terms of the support built for the LGBTIQ community and the reforms that have been achieved and we've talked about tonight is partly because that consensus has been built party by party, person by person, to the point that this is not a radical idea anymore. I mean, we've got a couple of members in the upper house who probably wouldn't be thrilled about tonight. I don't know whether they're watching. Hello. They might be writing down how annoyed they are so that they can tell me about it later. But no, really, I think my genuine view is democracy is hard, building consensus is hard, change is hard, but when you can get a very good working majority that's now not just 50% plus one, that is literally 60, 70, 80% of the parliament on these really important issues, that's been good work, and that means it also it's long-lived. We're not looking at a wind back. That's the other thing.
Can I just say something? The existence of the crossbench actually makes it harder to wind back. If you look at, for instance, United States politics at the present time, where you get a shift backwards and forwards, you could get profound changes, abortion law reform being an example. I think we can all be quite safe that style of reform is virtually impossible to unwind in New South Wales because of this ragtag collection that we have in the upper house. But if you had a government with a majority, then you're at risk that somebody will say, no, look, we'll knock those people over, and not only will we take control of the Treasury purse, but we'll unwind all the social reform that was done over 20 years. So the grab bag that we have there actually does provide that break on those radical shifts. So I think it's very hard to unwind so much that we did, thank goodness.
One of the things that
Did you want to hear from me?
Oh, Richard, I'd love to hear.
No, I just want to say, like, as just the only person who's not a member, or former member of the Legislative Council, I think did Paul Keating, I think, did he refer to the Senate as unrepresentative swill, I think? Yeah.
No, please thank Richard for being involved tonight.
No, I was just saying, so I take it that the three of you are against a unicameral legislature?
Yes.
Oh, yes, okay.
I do need to note that the Labor Party's, New South Wales Labor Party's still official position is that if the vote was to come to abolish the upper house, I am supposed to support it. Jack Lang tried it, and there was a rebellion, and the Labor members at the time said, "No way, no one's tried it again." But
well, the last thing about Jack Lang is he appointed members to the council specifically to vote to abolish the council.
And then they
but
didn't
once
vote.
they got there, they thought, this is so good, I'm not going to vote for that.
Could I just respond a little bit to Paul Keating? Because we have a very robust system of committees. People spend a lot of time in this building talking with each other. And it gets back to my point. You actually find you've got a lot more in common with people. One of my best friends in this place was Dr. John Kay. And he would stand up in the House and he'd shout over at our side that we were fascists. And then we'd go outside and we'd talk about that he had bad hips and I had bad hips and what were we going to do about cannabis law reform or whatever else. It's quite a different environment in which we work in. People who are in the Shooters and Fishers Party. Like, I don't know what I had in common. But you could have a civil and sensible conversation with them, and at times with Fred. That's the nature of the upper house. It is a very, very different beast. So if you went to a unicameral system, what you're essentially condemning this state or Australia to, if you did it overall, is an American style of politics where somebody controls the place, and that's the end of the discussion. We've got the numbers, and the rest of you are just going to fall into line. And I think it would be a disaster for democracy, and it would be a disaster for long-term effective reform.
One of the things that many of the crossbench did support was in 1996, where there was legislation passed that made really important inroads into recognising transgender status and rights. And I recognise that we don't have a trans person on the panel tonight, but I'm interested in all of your views about the importance of those reforms and I guess the journey that the trans community has often had to endure over the last 30 years.
Sure. Look, I speak for myself, of course. 30 years ago, I did not understand that word, really, and it was something that had not affected my life. And now, as a person of a certain age, I have friends with trans kids. And I'll tell you, there's only one thing that's important, and that is that everyone should be happy and be able to live a fulfilling and happy life. And trans people are entitled to the same aspirations as the rest of us. And so I'm kind of proud to live in a place that recognized that, at least in its infancy, as an idea in 1996, almost 30 years ago, because it took me, personally, a lot longer to understand it. I don't pretend to have a perfect understanding of it, but, with kindness, and kindness at the political level, it's something I think that's achievable. You wanted to be second, didn't you?
No, what he said. I think that's fair. I think we know that our anti-discrimination legislation in New South Wales is in urgent need of reform. I said I was going to come here and not make a political thing about the future, but there's an urgent need for reform in that area, and really one of the problems is what was started essentially 30 years ago has not really progressed from there, and so I don't think one can rest on one's laurels. I think there is a long, hard struggle on those matters to go. But again, and I'm sorry to keep referring back to the United States, but it just horrifies me there how issues can become so appallingly politicised and dehumanising for the individuals. At least, even though we're neglectful, we're not actually arming one side of politics or the other to essentially marginalise again a part of the community.
trans and gender diverse people have been part of our communities forever. Our First Nations people recognise sister boys and sister girls. They exist in every society. Trans and gender diversity is part of the human condition. And they're also one of the most marginalised groups. I think that 1996 was incredibly important because we realised that, but as Trevor says, not much has happened since then, and there is much unfinished business that we need to do. Because I think that is what it's want. I can't sit here tonight and not, do a shout out for all the trans people who have stood with the gay and lesbian community as allies through, whether it was Stonewall, whether it was Mardi Gras, whether it was the whole kind of, gay and lesbian liberation. Trans people were right in the middle of that. And I think it's upon all of us to show that level of solidarity and allyship to get the rest of the reform done. I think the good news is that we are actually progressing on that in New South Wales. We know that the other states have done this work. We are behind, but we are getting there. And the thing that I'd also say is I think that the recognition of the law reform has been poor, but I think that the improvement in relation to services and support is improving all the time. And I'd note that in New South Wales we've got 2 clinics for young people and a third one is opening. We've been funding the Gender Centre for I think 40 years. All again that work that was done under the Rand government and the fund, people like Frank Walker and others, really got the money there to support some of that work. So it's not all bad, but I think that we've got work to do, and I profoundly feel that sense of need that it's on us to make sure that we push through on this because it's a harder issue. And what really scares me is that the arguments and discussion, the fact that trans people in our lives are treated as something to debate, and they're treated as something that it's okay to be to basically endanger their lives and the lives of young people as a result of our response is something that's not okay. And I think that we all need to sort of stand up and really call that out when we see it, because lives are actually being harmed as a result of that. But the other point I'd say is that the trans and gender diverse people in my life are incredibly resilient, are incredibly strong, and are demanding change. And I just want to stand with them and help them achieve that.
Hear, hear. Can I just add one thing? What has happened since 1996, I think, here's a half-glass full view, is that there's been a lot of education about trans people. And so, for example, I'll just tell you today, in the Supreme Court of New South Wales, in an admission ceremony of I don't know how many lawyers, new, young, vibrant, intelligent lawyers, the representatives of the New South Wales Bar Association and the Law Society said, not for the first time, these organizations are available to everyone, irrespective of race or gender or sexuality, so that now there is inclusion, even in the staid Supreme Court, Banco Court of the Supreme Court of New South Wales. So I see progress. I mean, there's a lot to happen. But, I'm just so happy to hear that from young people who are so much better equipped at this than old people.
They're much cooler than us.
They're so much cooler. They're so much cooler, right? They are, yeah. But anyway, that happened today, 5 times today.
Yeah, fantastic. Which brings us to our third topic, towards equality. As the face of families in the New South Wales community began to change, calls grew for the legal recognition of same-sex relationships. In 1999, an upper house inquiry examined options for recognising same-sex couples under de facto relationships. But before the inquiry had even concluded, a bill was introduced into the upper house legally recognising same-sex couples under de facto relationships, which passed in mid-1999. The march towards equality continued with the age of consent laws, inclusion in adoption and surrogacy laws, and even an attempt to introduce same-sex marriage 4 years before the Australia-wide yes vote. But it was also a time to redress past injustices and support the healing process, with laws passed to remove historic convictions for homosexuality under the Crimes Act and a landmark inquiry into gay and transgender hate crime that led to a world-first commission of inquiry. Penny, in 2008, an upper house bill successfully passed that provided recognition and equal treatment to same-sex lesbian de facto partners as parents. The Changes to the Status of Children Act. Can you tell us a bit about the significance of these changes, but also what it was like to be involved in a debate on law reform that impacted you and your family in such a direct and personal way?
Well, again, I would shout out to all of those that campaigned for this. Ghassan's gone to the bar now, but Ghassan, I don't think he's here tonight, was at the Gay and Lesbian Rights Lobby, and there was a huge campaign about recognising families and recognising our kids. The situation in the law was that if you were a lesbian couple, that only one of you who birthed the child was considered to be the parent, and it meant that essentially we had a whole group of children that didn't have the protection of having two parents. When I was first elected to Parliament, I had 2 children at that point, and I was not recognised as their mother. One of those children is sitting over there tonight. He's now almost 20. He's just over there. Hi, Red. I'm just going to embarrass you. Hello, darling. He used to come into Parliament with me when I was first in because we didn't have childcare one day a week, so he used to come around this place a bit. But no, look, I think, again, that whole, our lives as, gay men and lesbians and part of the, the whole, LGBTIQ community has been contested and has been debated about whether we're safe people to have children, whether we can provide loving families, whether our relationships are worthy of having families. I mean, what the biggest load of rubbish in the world. Our families are deliberately made. There's no accidents happening here. They've been thought about a great deal. Again, an aside, before Joe and I had our own kids, we were foster carers for young women when we were in our late 20s. We did fostering for a while. I've seen kids who've had some pretty tough lives, and, the idea that you can create a loving family, I think Rainbow Families talk about, love makes a family. I think it's incredibly important. It was important personally for me because it meant I could get on the birth certificate of my kids, and it means that my kids have got protection in relation to those things. And, I still have women who have just had kids who occasionally write to me and say, we just got the birth certificate and we're on it and it's just amazing. We've got a bit more work to do. Our families are also pretty complicated. There's a lot of us who have got more than 2 parents, and there's some very lucky kids out there who've got more than 2 parents. I think there's still a bit of work to be done on that. The world's not going to collapse to recognise that there's more people loving a child, I would have thought. So look, I think, for me, it was one of the first times. It was profoundly moving for me, where you're actually making a law that actually really directly affects you. But also, I think it was the family debate within our community is something that every bit of progress is important, because it is about what it fundamentally is to be human, to form families, to be in loving, caring units of society that bring so much more to our community than just the fact that, you live together and you're there. And I think I have a very broad view when I'm talking about families. For me, it's a very broad concept because I am very fortunate to live within lovely families, and most of my friends have these incredible families that we've built over time. And so it was profoundly moving, still is, but I think it also was another chip in the block around just, we're just normal folks living our lives and should be able to do that. And it's really important to say that we recognise that is the same as everyone else.
Another important issue that was addressed by the Parliament was in 2012, when an upper house inquiry into the partial defence of provocation in murder trials, which you referred to before, Trev, led to laws in 2014 that ended the so-called homosexual advance defence. You're involved in both of those, in the inquiry and in the legislation. How did provocation become an issue again? And can you talk to us about the importance of the reforms recommended by the inquiry and the subsequent changes in the law? And Richard, I'd be really interested in your views on that too.
Sure.
Well, it was a long time since when I came in here, it was a long time since I'd been at university and practising in the country. I was just a traffic court lawyer. Still am, as it turns out. Went back home. It really all started by Justin Coonan and co turning up in my office with a long screed of things that needed to be fixed, and one of them was Crown and Green. That's the homosexual advance High Court case. It essentially started with me writing off to the then Attorney General, Greg Smith, trying to get him interested in doing this, and his staffers, I suspect that Greg never even saw my letters. The staffers that intercept these letters and would come and see my staffers and say, what's he interested in this stuff for? So it went nowhere. And it sort of bubbled along for a while, and there are a number of people in the House, Adam Searle, Helen Westwood, a number of people David Shoebridge in the Greens that were interested in it, that you could talk to them about it. But we didn't really have a hook, and this is the sad part about legislating. Didn't have a hook to do it. And then publicity came about a terrible killing that occurred in Sydney. The lady's name was Manpreet Kaur, and she was killed by her husband, Chamanjot Singh, on the front porch of their flat. He cut her throat and she bled out over a period of time. And he then, not literally, but got on his bike and he actually got on the bus and went to Victoria, was extradited from Victoria, brought back to New South Wales. He was eventually tried for murder, and he ran provocation. Provocation, in his case, was that when they were having this dispute about the end of the marriage, she was older than him. She'd brought him out from India under an arranged marriage. Well, she didn't bring it out. The family insisted that he came out here. And there was an argument over the dowry, and she wanted the dowry back. And that, in a sense, formed the basis of the provocation. He was so outraged as to what was being done that this was the appropriate action of him slitting her throat. Now, I don't remember now precisely what the term of imprisonment that was imposed. He was found not guilty of murder, convicted of manslaughter, and I think he got 9 years on the top, 6 years on the bottom. I'm not allowed to talk about it.
Yeah, but that'd be about right.
Yeah, that's right. And it was an outrage. It was an outrage that a man could cut his wife's throat and only serve 6 years. And that was the hook. That's the nature of legislating somebody. Justifiably, some of us could stand up in the Parliament and say, this is an outrage. The then Premier, Barry O'Farrell, was sufficiently moved that he allowed, not the Attorney General, he allowed in a sense, for the government to accede, because I think the numbers may well have existed with the assistance of Fred Nile and the Labor Party and the Greens, but everyone in the end said, all right, we'll run the inquiry, and the two components of it were whether, well, there's more than two components, whether provocation should continue to exist, and if it was to exist, in what circumstances it would. Greens on this inquiry, a Nat, heaven would think that a Nat would be on, Liberal, Labor.
Just to be clear, that not being you.
Well, it was. Fred Nile. And in the end of the day, and there was great evidence that was received by the inquiry, and at the end of the day, it was all agreed. I must say, during the committee stage, David Shoebridge was really poking Fred on the homosexual advance defence, and you think, oh gosh, it seems to be going so well, this is all going to fall apart here. But everyone voted for it, and away we went. And it didn't quite turn out how we wanted, but the Attorney General, to his credit, crafted a bill, and it flew through. Yeah. It was an example of how the sausage is made. It wasn't easy. It required a set of circumstances, but it required people having talked to each other for a long period of time. And at the end of the day, we got what we wanted. We got what we wanted, and it was a good reform.
Yeah, look, for those of you who may not understand what we're talking about, no, it's all right. No, I know. It's fair enough. This was also known as the homosexual panic defense. And so someone could say that they were provoked by an unwanted, non-violent homosexual advance in partial defense of a charge of murder. And if that was accepted, then there would be a finding of manslaughter. I must say, when I was a very baby barrister, in fact, as a reader, I was involved in 2 cases back to back, and Robert Titterton, who is here tonight and who I shared chambers with, may very well remember those 2 cases. I won't name them, one of which was presided over by the Chief Justice at the time. And that defense was raised in both cases and was successful. This is 1993. I was shocked by it. However, I will add that at that time, an accused person could make an unsworn statement from the dock, and that, greatly to the Parliament's credit, was abolished in May of 1994. And so in those cases, I think shockingly, the accused were found guilty of manslaughter, but based on their unsworn statements from the dock. Anyway, that no longer exists. Good.
The final specific parliamentary focus that I wanted to just have a brief discussion about was, of course, in 2021 when the final report of the 3-year Upper House inquiry into gay and transgender hate crimes that were committed from 1970 to 2010 handed down its final report. And its first recommendation was the establishment of a judicial inquiry into unsolved cases, which was established then, obviously, in 2022 with Justice John Saka of the Supreme Court appointed as Commissioner. It was lauded as a world first. I would love to get the perspectives from the 3 of you about the importance of that inquiry and its meaning to the community.
Do you want to start?
No, I think you should start.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think it's been profoundly important. The first thing I'd say, because I know there's many people in the audience who'll go, well, where's the government response, and hurry up. All I'll say is that we're very close, and I think that it's been profoundly important. I think that the establishment, the thing that I would reflect, which is again a bit more about how the sausages are made, the establishment of the parliamentary inquiry to start off on this was not an easy thing to do. It was opposed very vociferously by some. It was very hard to actually get together. So even the establishment of it was important. And again, you know, shout out to those in the community who've been doing this work. I mean, I'll always miss people, but, you know, ACON's been on this. There's been, you know, a range of different police inquiries and reviews. And as we know, the Special Commission really exposed the failings of a lot of those. There's been just a lot of resistance over a long period of time. We need to understand what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with a time in this city where men were thrown off cliffs and murdered. We can't hide from that. And there was very poor practices as a result. So the commission, I think, was really important. I'll just say a few things about them. One is, again, a shout out to someone who, I think I'm involved in the launch of his book this week, and I know there'll be people here. Steve Johnson. Steve Johnson, a fantastic man who basically has spent decades fighting for justice for his brother, who was murdered, and who the police insisted was that it was a suicide. And over many decades and a lot of time and effort, Steve has just never given up on finding justice for Scott. And as a result of his efforts and then working with so many of the other groups, a shout out to Support After Murder, Peter Rolfe. There's a whole range of people behind the scenes, the sort of Sue Thompsons, Jackie Milich, who was the coroner. There's a huge story to tell about everyone who's made a difference to that. Point I'd make is the government's going to be making a response, and it's going to be profoundly important. We've got to still work through and get justice for those who have been left behind, for those who were murdered and those who were viciously beaten. It's taken way too long for that. But I think we're really close. But the point I again would make is, and this is one of those sort of slightly different ones, yes, there was campaigning around all of that. It actually took some politicians to just be prepared to stare down some of that. And I want to put a shout out to Luke Foley, who was actually the leader of the opposition at the time. He was the one when some of us went and talked to him and said and Peter Rolfe was really important in his talking to Luke about this, about why it was important, about why we need to get justice for all of these unsolved cases. And Luke was prepared to go, no, we need to do something about that. I'll back from opposition this inquiry. I was very lucky to be put on it as well. But it is one of those things that you do sometimes, like the pressure comes from outside, but you do need people inside to step up. And there was a whole lot of people that did and really, stared that down. Trevor's probably got a bit more on that, but it's really important. The outcome of it is going to be profoundly important, and we're really close.
Penny's in a more awkward position than I am now because I've left the building. What was clear from the inquiry was the level of resistance from within New South Wales Police. There were individual police officers who came along who would tell horrific stories of what had occurred, how they were blocked in trying to follow various lines of inquiry, how they were taken off cases rather than being allowed to. Now, there's sometimes reasons that officers are taken off cases. They become manic about them, they lose all perspective, that's quite right. But there was a consistent line there by some officers with regards to what was occurring. And clearly, in terms of the judicial inquiry, it demonstrated that one of the problems, in any institution you get it, like it's just the nature of institutions, but what you saw was even really up until the present day, there were sections of the police force that really weren't prepared to allow the light to be shone on what occurred. And it's not just the individuals who were killed, who were bashed, it's that so many people would go to a police station and say, we have seen something, we've been touched up, and they were treated with absolute disdain. Get out of here, we're not interested. Look, if you want to do something, you go to the local court or the magistrate's court or the Court of Petty Sessions and you can file your own assault charge or whatever. Get out of here, you bum. That's the problem. It wasn't just the direct individuals that were involved. It was a community that was marginalised, ignored and treated with disrespect. And frankly, it goes back to what we talked about before in terms of decriminalisation. Decriminalisation was important because it levels a bit the playing field. But it's a societal change that has to occur. People are entitled to be treated like everyone else. That's the journey we've been on. And I think in terms of the inquiry that was held in the upper house and then the judicial inquiry, it was a demonstration. Still a bit of work to go.
Can I just say one just quickly, another shout out to individuals. So Mike Gallagher. Yes. Mike Gallagher was the police minister. He was an MLC. Mike's on the much more conservative side of politics than me, but he was someone who took up particularly Scott Johnson's case as police minister to try and drive some reform. And he,
Got some pushback.
he's got some pretty wild stories about that. They're not my stories to tell, but I would just say that, again, occasionally you need people to step up, and he was one of those who did that.
Look, I'll just add a couple of things. Not much you can say after you've both spoken so eloquently. But I think at the beginning of tonight, I told you that I wore a whistle in about 1981. And that was because if I had been assaulted or attacked, I was not going to go to the Darlinghurst or the King's Cross police station, knowing what was occurring with police and the gay community at that time when people were being thrown off cliffs. And so really there was no one at that time to protect us but ourselves. I think that's how we all felt.
And the ducks on bikes.
Oh, yeah. Still. And the second thing I was going to say is, with respect to the parliamentary commission and then the special commission of inquiry, is that before reconciliation must come truth. And that's really important, and it's great that it's really positive that truth can be spoken, and then reconciliation can happen. And the third thing I want to say, a bit more of on a personal level. Steve Johnson, I've been listening to him for years. It feels like forever, actually. And what I just want to say about him is that everyone should have a brother like that. Yes. I have a sister like that. She lives in the United States. I never see her. I love her so much. She would do that for me. He is so lucky. Scott, no longer with us, but so lucky to have a brother that loved him so much. And what a great example he is as a sibling. Yeah.
So tonight we sit at the end of 4 decades of a journey for the LGBTQIA plus community, 4 decades of reform, sometimes 2 steps forward, 1 step back, but much has been done. I think, though, we all agree that much more still needs to happen. Before we throw to questions from the audience, I would just like to ask 2 more questions to all of our panellists this evening. And the first is this. In a recent opinion piece in the Star Observer on Lesbian Visibility Day, Penny Sharpe, you wrote, and I quote, "I naively thought being a lesbian in a public role would not matter to anyone, but I've learned that it does matter to many." I'd love for the 3 of you to reflect on the importance of having leaders who are out and proud being seen in these sorts of roles.
Oh, they quoted you. They quoted you. Oh, look, it's so important. Look, when I was growing up, I felt alone. I mean, I thought I was the only person who was feeling these crazy feelings. And it was only later, really, much later, when I felt a community. I felt a community, as I've told you, in my 20s in Australia during hard times. And then I'll tell you, when I went to the bar in 1993, which is 30 years ago, I mean, that I felt like the only gay person at the bar. But, things have changed, and I hope that I've been able to be, as an out gay man the whole time, I hope that I've been able to be someone who someone could look up to as someone who could succeed. I mean, I always tell the Chief Justice, who is here tonight, that he profiles me as the gay judge. He really does. But you know, he really does.
He's saying no.
He does. He's my friend, but he does. But I think it is so important to be out because there are kids out there who are feeling marginalized still, right? And if I can make a difference at all in the conduct of my life, well then, that's what else can you hope for? I think I really wanted you to start. Yeah.
There's probably three things I want to say about this, which isn't quite the on the question. The first thing is to go back to the upper house and the need for diversity in our parliaments, for our parliaments to look like our people, for them to be equal in gender and far more diverse than they currently are. I've been in Parliament, scarily, for 19 years this year, and the change that I have seen, when I came into Parliament, I was the first woman to admit that she was a lesbian. I never say that I was the first lesbian elected. It sometimes says that, but I just think it's an important distinction. And I was able to come in off the back of people like Paul O'Grady, who had been the first openly gay man in the Parliament, and who, after he left Parliament, had also been open about his HIV status and those kind of things. It was a much lonelier road to hoe, I think, for people like Paul, although he was fierce and a warrior and really, didn't muck around in terms of these issues. I have actually, over time, been able to share the Parliament with a range of different, members of our community as members of Parliament. And my reflection about that is, I'll get to the visibility bit in a minute, but my reflection about that really is, when you have people like, people with different, doesn't matter what it is, particular experience, lived experience in the room as we're dealing with the challenges that the state faces, we are so much better when we've got people who can speak the truth to what this actually means for people. What it means to not be on your child's birth certificate, what it means to not be able to get a job, what it means to not be able to visit your partner in hospital, or Paul used to tell a story about when, he rang 000 after he and his partner had been bashed off Oxford Street, and they basically told him to go away. Like that sort of decision-making and speaking truth to power and understanding people's lived experience makes for better democracies and makes for better laws and helps us to progress. So I think just having us in the room, no matter who we are, even we disagree on a lot of politics as well, I think that's really important. And the visible thing, I think, at the end of the day, my experience of what visibility means is that stuff, and I wrote about this, is, the staff that kind of in the Parliament who come and tell me about something that's going on for their kid, the teachers that reach out to me on social media asking about how they can support a trans kid in their classroom, the kind of, the fierce, excellent young women who, want to come and talk to me about a whole range of stuff. I think it's such a privilege to be able to be so open and free because so many people can't be. I think that's the other thing. I think we've got to always recognise that with our community we're always on a journey, and people need to choose their own journey in the way that they choose to express that. And for those of us that are able to be out and loud and proud and annoying, it's a privilege, but it brings with it a massive responsibility to try and do the right thing, and that's the way I kind of like to think about it.
Well, it may not be a direct answer, but I'll give you an answer. When I came into the National Party room in, when was that? 2007. I've had a mental block. Who was the former member for Orange back at that time?
Russell Turner.
Russell Turner.
The first person who came and said hello to me when I started in Parliament.
So Russell came from Orange, and his son was gay. Ran a coffee shop in Orange, and so when the consent law reforms were going on, he was the only one with the with the guts in that party to actually say, no, look, the way the party has behaved on this in the past is wrong. And I can remember when he left, which I think was in 2011, he spoke just at the end of the previous parliament, and we'd done status of children. I think we'd done adoption. And I had taken a position with that, reasonably lonely. But Russell, in the party room, on the way out in that final time, says, it's over to you, Trev, now. You're the one that has to carry it forward. And really, all the way through for me, was to say to my colleagues, why? Why are you opposing this legislation? Why aren't we supporting it? We live in small communities, diverse small communities. Everyone's entitled to be treated decently. Everyone's entitled to be treated as a human being. Nobody needs to be labelled. That was the discussion. Time and again, it was the discussion. And time and again, it was the discussion that the majority accepted. That's been, in my view, the problem for too long. The churches have had a profound impact on both sides of politics in terms of what's right and what's wrong. And look, I'm not, well, no, I won't say that. And really, politicians are inherently, most inherently conservative. They don't want to upset their communities, so they won't do anything that they think will lose them a small percentage of votes. And really what you've got to do, well, for me, was what I've got to do is get them to think not in terms of whether they're going to lose half a dozen votes at a cake stall that's held outside St Mary's or wherever, but actually what this is about, if you come into this place, you're given a profound opportunity to do the right thing, and it's the right thing you should do, not the thing that gets you the votes. And it sort of worked. So that's what I did, and that was my motivation in terms of this exercise.
Well, thank you, and thank you to you all for attending what I think you'll agree has been a really interesting and important conversation tonight. Can I particularly thank our three panellists for their honesty, for their candour, and for their generosity in sharing experiences that were personal to them, as well as their philosophical and policy views. Can I also thank the Legislative Council's Black Rod team for... Yes, led by the usher of the Black Rod, Janelle Moore, and for all of their work on making this evening such a success. This is part of our bicentenary program. We are having a series of seminars, as I said at the beginning of the evening. If you're interested, the next two seminars coming up are on culturally and linguistically diverse communities on the 9th of August, and then on the 12th of September on the Wiradjuri and Frontier Wars, because martial law was declared 200 years ago as well, and is a part of our history that we must also never forget. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all, in fact, everyone, I should say. Thank you all very much for being here, and please have a safe trip home.